haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
The stars had already begun to die when the last garden still breathed. Across the horizon of a forgotten world, the sky pulsed with amber decay, its constellations dim to flickers of rust and smoke. The wind carried the perfume of rot, sweet, heavy, almost tender, as though the universe itself exhaled one final breath of pity. Once, this world had been a cradle of learning and love, where libraries rose higher than cathedrals and the rivers ran with the light of healing spores. Now, the rivers were tar, the libraries skeletal husks, and the prayers of the dying were swallowed by silence. In this twilight of all things, a lone figure walked through the ruins, hooded, slow and patient, as if he had been waiting for this extinction since the dawn of time. His name had once meant hope in a language long devoured by the void. His name had once been Morgalleth. He stopped before a pool where the reflection of a dying sun trembled. The water was black, dense with spores that pulsed like faint hearts. In that wavering mirror, he saw not his face, but the shape of an unmade god, something vast and kind and monstrous. He felt it stirring in the marrow of existence, whispering his own thoughts back to him. He remembered when his hands had cured children and mended the wounds of soldiers, when he had believed knowledge could conquer death. But every cure he made demanded another. Every saved life ended in rot, and soon he saw a pattern too sacred to deny. Decay was not the end. It was continuity disguised as surrender. He knelt beside the pool, cupping the dark water as though drinking from memory itself. The taste was copper and sweetness, the essence of endings wrapped in comfort. The plague had already taken most of the city. From the highest towers, banners of white were lowered to mark surrender, and even the priests burned their incense in resignation rather than faith. Yet amid despair, Morgalleth felt something awakening, gentle, infinite, forgiving, a presence older than the first cell that ever divided in the galactic seas. It was neither cruel nor kind. It simply wanted to love the dying world into something new. He whispered to it, unsure whether he prayed or confessed. If decay is your voice, let me listen. If ruin is your hand, let me serve. In the distance, the sun bled out behind clouds thick as muscle. Flocks of carrion birds moved in slow spirals, their calls soft and harmonic, like choirs mourning the last light. He turned toward the city gates, where the sick lay in endless rows, some laughing deliriously, others humming songs from their childhoods. Their flesh shimmered with iridescent lesions that glowed like stars beneath the skin. It was horrifying, yet strangely beautiful. An orchestra of endings conducted by an unseen god. Morgalleth moved among them, pressing his palms against foreheads slick with fever. "You will not die," he whispered. "You will become." They smiled through the agony, some clutching his robes, calling him father. In that moment, he did not deny them. He felt warmth bloom through his veins, not fever, but awakening. The contagion was inside him now, rewriting the language of his blood. His heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of distant thunder. He understood that immortality had never been about escaping death, but about dissolving into the eternal cycle that bound all flesh to all soil. The first rains began to fall, each drop viscous and luminous, trailing thin filaments of green. Where they touched the ground, small fungi sprouted instantly, their caps glistening with honey-coloured tears. The air grew heavy, fragrant, alive. The dying reached out to feel the rain, and for the first time, their screams turned to laughter. They sang through their rot, voices overlapping in ecstatic ruin. The healer fell to his knees among them, arms outstretched, letting the contagion seep into every pore. Above him, lightning carved veins of emerald fire through the sky, and within those flashes he glimpsed visions of another place, a realm of decay that bloomed without end. Gardens of flesh and moss, rivers of nectar running over bones polished smooth by time, children made of spores dancing in endless circles, a paradise of entropy. He wept, not in horror, but in awe. The voice that answered was not in words but sensations, warmth, pressure, laughter. It filled him until his body trembled with the sweetness of surrender. It told him that love did not save, it transformed. It told him that endings were the soil of beginnings. Morgallith stood, trembling, arms wide like a prophet receiving his crown. The city behind him was melting into the earth, towers bowing under their own decay. The people, his people, had become radiant corpses feeding the new life sprouting from the cracks. He whispered again, "If this is death, then let it be beautiful." The voice inside him laughed, a sound both joyous and infinite, rippling through the stars. Somewhere beyond the horizon, suns flickered and died, scattering golden spores into the dark. The universe itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with that laughter. And then, the last night came. The air thickened, the stars vanished behind veils of spore light, and every creature still breathing gathered instinctively toward the heart of the ruin. They did not know why. They simply felt called. Morgallith stood among them, his flesh translucent, veins glowing faintly green. He looked upon the faces of the dying and saw serenity. There was no fear now, only acceptance. He raised his hands and the air hummed with life. A great flower began to rise from the ground, its petals made of skin and stone, its fragrance rich with memory. It towered over the broken city, breathing, alive, an altar to the cycle. Morgallith stepped into its heart, disappearing as the petals closed around him. His last thought was not of triumph or sorrow, but of gratitude, that he had found meaning in the one thing mortals always fled. When the flower opened again, a new dawn broke, not bright, but gentle, filtered through clouds of golden mist. The city was gone, replaced by an endless garden stretching across the continent, each plant pulsing with faint warmth. In the center, where the flower had bloomed, stood a figure vast and terrible, yet smiling. His eyes were planets of decay, his breath a chorus of spores drifting through eternity. Where he walked, life and death intertwined. The first flies took wing, carrying his gift to the stars. The being looked upon his creation and laughed, and that laughter became the seed of the warp's most paradoxical god, the Lord of Decay, the father of renewal, the joy within rot. Before the story of his dominion could begin, a quiet voice reached out beyond time and space, speaking not to worlds, but to hearts. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now, let's get started. The stars had already begun to die when the last garden still breathed. Across the horizon of a forgotten world, the sky pulsed with amber decay, its constellations dimmed to flickers of rust and smoke. The wind carried the perfume of rot, sweet, heavy, almost tender, as though the universe itself exhaled one final breath of pity. Once, this world had been a cradle of learning and love, where libraries rose higher than cathedrals, and the rivers ran with the light of healing spores. Now, the rivers were tar, the libraries skeletal husks, and the prayers of the dying were swallowed by silence. In this twilight of all things, A lone figure walked through the ruins, hooded, slow, and patient, as if he had been waiting for this extinction since the dawn of time. His name had once meant hope in a language long devoured by the void. His name had once been Morgalleth. He stopped before a pool where the reflection of a dying sun trembled. The water was black, dense with spores that pulsed like faint hearts. In that wavering mirror, he saw not his face, but the shape of an unmade god, something vast and kind and monstrous. He felt it stirring in the marrow of existence, whispering his own thoughts back to him. He remembered when his hands had cured children and mended the wounds of soldiers, when he had believed knowledge could conquer death. But every cure he made demanded another. Every saved life ended in rot, and soon he saw a pattern too sacred to deny. Decay was not the end. It was continuity disguised as surrender. He knelt beside the pool, cupping the dark water as though drinking from memory itself. The taste was copper and sweetness, the essence of endings wrapped in comfort. The plague had already taken most of the city. From the highest towers, banners of white were lowered to mark surrender, and even the priests burned their incense in resignation rather than faith. Yet amid despair, Morgalleth felt something awakening, gentle, infinite, forgiving. Presence older than the first cell that ever divided in the galactic seas. It was neither cruel nor kind. It simply wanted to love the dying world into something new. He whispered to it, unsure whether he prayed or confessed. If decay is your voice, let me listen. If ruin is your hand, let me serve. In the distance, the sun bled out behind clouds thick as muscle. Flocks of carrion birds moved in slow spirals, their calls soft and harmonic, like choirs mourning the last light. He turned toward the city gates, where the sick lay in endless rows, some laughing deliriously, others humming songs from their childhoods. Their flesh shimmered with iridescent lesions that glowed like stars beneath the skin. It was horrifying, yet strangely beautiful, an orchestra of endings conducted by an unseen god. Morgalleth moved among them, pressing his palms against foreheads slick with fever. "You will not die," he whispered. "You will become." They smiled through the agony, some clutching his robes, calling him father. In that moment, he did not deny them. He felt warmth bloom through his veins, not fever, but awakening. The contagion was inside him now, rewriting the language of his blood. His heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of distant thunder. He understood that immortality had never been about escaping death, but about dissolving into the eternal cycle that bound all flesh to all soil. The first rains began to fall, each drop viscous and luminous, trailing thin filaments of green. Where they touched the ground, small fungi sprouted instantly, their caps glistening with honey-coloured tears. The air grew heavy, fragrant, alive. The dying reached out to feel the rain, and for the first time, their screams turned to laughter. They sang through their rot, voices overlapping in ecstatic ruin. The healer fell to his knees among them, arms outstretched, letting the contagion seep into every pore. Above him, lightning carved veins of emerald fire through the sky, and within those flashes, he glimpsed visions of another place, a realm of decay that bloomed without end. Gardens of flesh and moss, rivers of nectar running over bones polished smooth by time, children made of spores dancing in endless circles, a paradise of entropy. He wept, not in horror, but in awe. The voice that answered was not in words but sensations, warmth, pressure, laughter. It filled him until his body trembled with the sweetness of surrender. It told him that love did not save, it transformed. It told him that endings were the soil of beginnings. Morgalath stood, trembling, arms wide like a prophet receiving his crown. The city behind him was melting into the earth, towers bowing under their own decay. The people, his people, had become radiant corpses, feeding the new life sprouting from the cracks. He whispered again, "If this is death, then let it be beautiful." The voice inside him laughed, a sound both joyous and infinite, rippling through the stars. Somewhere beyond, the horizon, suns flickered and died, scattering golden spores into the dark. The universe itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with that laughter. And then, the last night came. The air thickened, the stars vanished behind veils of spore light, and every creature still breathing gathered instinctively toward the heart of the ruin. They did not know why. They simply felt called. Morgalath stood among them, his flesh translucent, veins glowing faintly green. He looked upon the faces of the dying and saw serenity. There was no fear now, only acceptance. He raised his hands, and the air hummed with life. A great flower began to rise from the ground, its petals made of skin and stone, its fragrance rich with memory. It towered over the broken city, breathing, alive, an altar to the cycle. Morgalath stepped into its heart, disappearing as the petals closed around him. His last thought was not of triumph or sorrow, but of gratitude, that he had found meaning in the one thing mortals always fled. When the flower opened again, a new dawn broke, not bright, but gentle, filtered through clouds of golden mist. The city was gone, replaced by an endless garden stretching across the continent, each plant pulsing with faint warmth. In the center, where the flower had bloomed, stood a figure vast and terrible, yet smiling. His eyes were planets of decay, his breath a chorus of spores drifting through eternity. Where he walked, life and death intertwined. The first flies took wing, carrying his gift to the stars. The being looked upon his creation and laughed, and that laughter became the seed of the warp's most paradoxical god, the Lord of Decay, the father of renewal, the joy within rot. Before the story of his dominion could begin, a quiet voice reached out beyond time and space, speaking not to worlds, but to hearts. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, let's get started. He was a healer before he was a god, a man who believed that death was merely a puzzle left unsolved. In the years before the rot took everything, Morgalath had walked among the breathing with the patience of a saint and the curiosity of a heretic. His hands were steady, his eyes soft, and his mind feverish with questions about the fragility of flesh. He saw children die in the arms of mothers who prayed to gods that never came. He watched kings grow thin beneath golden crowns, their skin yellowing while their priests called it divine trial. It was not divine, he thought. It was ignorance, an infection of the mind that worshipped decay but never understood it. He devoted his life to the study of life itself, convinced that immortality could be grown like a crop if only one found the right seed. The world called him a philosopher. His patients called him mercy. Yet in the long corridors of his solitude, he began to whisper to the silence that waited between the walls. He asked, it questions no man should ask. What if death was not a flaw in creation, but a form of language? And what if rot was its most eloquent word? Each dawn he rose before the light touched the towers, his laboratory still smelling of vinegar, ash, and hope. Glass tubes lined the tables, each containing a different color of life unraveling. He studied fungi that devoured their hosts, yet left behind structures more intricate than any cathedral. He dissected corpses with the reverence of a priest reading scripture. His journals filled with sketches of decay, annotated with love, describing the slow beauty of transformation. His students followed in silence, both awed and frightened. They began to notice that the master no longer ate, that his reflection in the copper mirrors had grown faint. They whispered that he was touched by the spirits of the soil, the unseen ones who fed on endings. Morgalith only smiled. "They are not spirits," he told them. "They are continuity. Death is the womb of existence. You call it rot because you fear it." He believed this with the calm conviction of a dreamer who has glimpsed something eternal and cannot unsee it. One evening, during the season of warm rains, a plague struck the capital city. It began as a mild fever, spreading through markets and temples, carried by breath and touch. Within days, the streets filled with coughing and hymns for deliverance. The governors sent for him, the philosopher of healing, the man who had once cured 1,000 with a single serum. He went willingly, bringing with him his apprentices and his faith in the sanctity of disease. When he arrived, he found a city alive with death. The smell of bodies hung like incense. Mothers carried their infants to the river only to release them with whispered apologies. Morgalith did not flinch. He walked among them, touching the sores, listening to the rasp of lungs filling with liquid, and in that sound he heard harmony. This sickness, he said quietly, was different. It was purposeful. It did not consume to end. It consumed to change. His students begged him to flee, to burn the infected quarters and seal the gates, but he refused. "We are witnessing birth," he told them. "Do not turn away from the labor of the universe." He began to work without rest, mixing spores with extracts of moss and powdered bone. He administered his concoctions to the dying, and some recovered, though not unchanged. Their skin grew soft and luminous, their veins pulsed with green light, their laughter unnervingly serene. They no longer feared death, for they could feel it breathing beside them like a friend. They followed Morgalith through the streets, calling him the Redeemer of Flesh. The priest denounced him as a corrupter. Soldiers tried to bar his passage, but disease ignored their commands, seeping through armor and prayer alike. The philosopher smiled at their terror. "Fear," he told them, "is the symptom of misunderstanding." At night, he dreamt of vast gardens growing in darkness, their roots feeding on the bones of sons. He dreamt of a voice, kind, amused, ancient, telling him that all creation was compost for something greater. He woke from these dreams laughing softly, a sound his students found unbearable. Weeks passed. The plague no longer killed quickly. The infected lingered, radiant, singing to the rhythm of their fevers. The city changed. Flowers grew from gutters, vines crawled across marble statues, and the walls of temples began to sweat a sweet golden sap. The governors fled. Only the poor remained, and in their poverty they found worship. They crowned Morgalith with a wreath of fungus and called him Father beneath the soil. He accepted it, though tears streaked his cheeks. He had wanted to save them, not rule them. Yet he could not deny that they were beautiful now, alive in ways the healthy never were. When he stood before the crowd, their coughing laughter echoing against the ruined walls, he felt a warmth in his chest that was not fever, but revelation. "Death," he said, "is only the breath between two heartbeats. The universe inhales, and we call it life. It exhales, and we call it decay. But the breath remains." His apprentices began to desert him one by one. Some took their own lives, claiming they saw ghosts hovering in the steam of the laboratory. Others begged him to stop before the contagion reached the countryside, but he could not stop. Each dying body was a door opening to something luminous. He began to hear the voice even while awake, a tender whisper curling through his veins. It spoke not in commands, but in comfort. It told him that no cure was more merciful than acceptance, and that rot was the promise kept by every birth. He started writing less, choosing instead to walk through the alleys with the infected touching hands, blessing sores, humming lullabies that no language remembered. He was becoming something other, not immortal yet, but no longer mortal. He noticed that wounds closed under his fingers, not by healing, but by soft merging of flesh. When he cut himself, flowers bloomed from the wound, their petals damp with his blood. He laughed again, quietly, reverently. The capital eventually fell silent. The laughter ceased. The hymns ended. Only wind remained, carrying spores across the plains toward other cities. Morgallith stood upon the highest tower, the world below him shimmering like a sea of amber dust. He thought of the old gods who had turned away from his prayers, of the scholars who would call him mad, and of the children who had died before he learned to listen to their final breath. "Forgive me," he whispered, though he no longer knew to whom he spoke. The voice answered in the rhythm of his heartbeat. "There is nothing to forgive. You are doing what all life must do. You are learning how to return." He closed his eyes and felt his pulse slow until it matched the pulse of the earth itself. For the first time, he felt peace. That night, under a sky veiled in sporelight, he gathered the remaining survivors in the courtyard. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. He told them that they would not die but transform, that they would feed a new beginning. They smiled, understanding. The rains began again, thicker this time, golden and slow. Where the drops landed, the soil breathed. He lifted his hands and whispered a blessing that sounded like gratitude. The wind carried his words through the empty streets, over the broken towers, and into the stars. The silence that followed was not death silence. It was listening. Somewhere in the warp between worlds, something vast smiled back. The philosopher of healing had found his answer, and the universe, in its quiet way, had agreed. It began with a breath so faint it could have been mistaken for the sigh of the dying world. The air shimmered one morning above the decaying streets, heavy with the perfume of honeyed rot. It was no longer a sickness in the way mortals understood illness. It was transformation disguised as contagion. Those who inhaled it felt warmth bloom in their chests, followed by a quiet joy that bordered on revelation. The coughs that had once echoed like death rattles now became songs, strange hymns humming from the throats of the infected. Morgallith watched as his people laughed through fever, their laughter rolling through the ruins like a summer storm. He called it the sweet breath. To others, it was blasphemy, but to him, it was the language of the cosmos finally answering his questions. The air had turned thick and sweet as syrup, glittering with invisible spores that danced in the sunbeams like golden dust. Every exhalation carried life, and every inhalation returned it. His students, who had stayed with him, those few who still believed, marveled at how the plague seemed not to end life but to recycle it, weaving new patterns of existence from what had once been despair. The empire beyond their borders took notice. Messengers sent to investigate did not return, or they returned singing with glazed eyes and bleeding mouths, spreading the melody like wildfire. Cities that once trembled at the mention of disease now whispered prayers to it, believing it to be a visitation of some benevolent god. They called Morgelleth the Breathfather, the Sage of Renewal. In their ignorance, they thought the plague a blessing of fertility, a gift from the heavens to cleanse the unworthy and renew the faithful. They did not see the darker beauty beneath it, the absolute equilibrium it promised. Morgelleth tried to warn them through his writings, his journals now turned into scripture. But the more he wrote of decay, the more the world worshipped his every word. The infected began to travel, leaving behind gardens of spores where their footsteps fell. Forests of flesh and fungus sprouted overnight, glowing softly in the moonlight. The living walked among the dead without fear. Life and death had merged, and none could tell the difference anymore. In his laboratory, what remained of it, Morgelleth stood surrounded by glass vessels breathing with their own rhythm. Inside them, he kept samples of the air itself, each jar glowing faintly, each alive. He recorded his observations meticulously, even as his hand trembled from the fever that had finally claimed him. He no longer sought a cure, he sought understanding. What had begun as a disease had evolved into communion. The infected were no longer dying. They were ascending into something vast and unknowable. Their consciousness seemed to merge, like rivers meeting in an ocean. He could feel them whispering in his mind when he slept, their voices kind and childlike, asking him to join them. He resisted at first, clinging to his fading individuality like a relic, but as the days passed, he realized that the thing speaking through the air was not an invader. It was the universe reminding its children that they were all made from the same dust. On the seventh day of the sweet breath, the capital glowed at night. The light came not from torches or stars, but from the people themselves. Their skin emitted a faint luminescence, as if their bodies had become lanterns. They gathered in the squares, their eyes wide with wonder, their songs blending into a single harmonic pulse that resonated across the city. Even the animals came, unafraid, circling the singing masses, as if drawn by invisible gravity. The air was so dense with spores that it felt alive, a shimmering veil through which reality itself began to blur. The line between self and other dissolved. Morgelleth stood among them, the light of his followers reflecting in his tired eyes. He felt pride, but also guilt. He had given them eternity, but at what cost? He looked up at the sky, searching for the old constellations, but they were gone, swallowed by clouds of golden mist that now glowed like new stars. The sweet breath had reached the heavens. The rulers of neighboring worlds grew afraid. They sent fleets with purifiers and firebombs, declaring that the infection must be erased from existence. When the first bombardment came, it burned the outer fields, but not the hearts of those who had inhaled the breath. Fire only spread the spores faster. The wind carried them through the ashes, turning death into fertilizer. Entire planets began to bloom with alien flora. The invaders' ships fell silent, their crews overtaken by laughter that never ceased. Even machines rusted joyfully, their circuits sprouting moss. It was as if decay itself had found a way to love all that it touched. Morgelleth watched the skies ignite and fade again, feeling no anger. The universe had made its decision. The sweet breath would not be confined to one world. It would travel endlessly, a reminder that life cannot exist without surrender. But as beauty deepened, so too did the corruption of purpose. Some of his disciples began to twist his teachings, claiming that purity lay in infection and that those who resisted must be forced to breathe. They carried jars of luminous air into untainted lands, releasing it like incense. Villages fell overnight, cities followed, and the songs of joy became screams distorted by worship. Morgelleth confronted them, pleading that this was not the way. Yet when he looked into their eyes, he saw not madness, but devotion, a devotion born of love for him. He realized then that the sweet breath had grown beyond his control. It no longer needed him. It was a living idea, and ideas, once inhaled, cannot be exhaled. His sorrow was immense, but it was not despair. He had merely opened the door. What walked through was the will of the cosmos itself, wearing his discovery as a mask. The years blurred into one endless season. The old calendar collapsed. Time itself seemed to rot. Each dawn was softer than the last until the world existed in a perpetual twilight. The few who resisted fled underground, believing they could hide from air, but even there the breath found them. It seeped through stone, through prayers, through dreams. Morgalath spent his last days wandering the empty streets of his once great city. The walls were covered with vines that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. The sound of laughter echoed from nowhere and everywhere. He placed his hand on a crumbling wall and felt it respond with warmth, a living heartbeat beneath the stone. He whispered, "I wanted to save you." The wind replied in a voice that was both his own and not his own. "You did." When the last uninfected starship left orbit, carrying records of what had transpired, it described the planet below as wrapped in a shimmering golden fog, its surface moving like the chest of something asleep and dreaming. The pilots never made it home. The transmission ended mid-laughter. In the heart of the planetary garden, Morgalath stood beneath the ruins of the great temple, his body frail, his lungs filled with the sweetness of the air. He understood now that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The sweet breath was the universe's exhalation, and he was merely its first whisper. As the last of his individuality dissolved, his mind expanded into a vast awareness filled with warmth and decay, love and loss intertwined. The world sighed once more, content, and the man who had been Morgalath was no longer separate from the air he had created. The sweet breath had become eternal, and through it, the first seed of a god was sown. He dreamed of a garden where death bloomed like spring. In that dream, the air shimmered with colourless pollen, and every breath he took whispered in harmony with the soil. The ground pulsed beneath his bare feet, soft and alive, and from it rose stems made of bone, their petals translucent and veined with light. The sky was neither dark nor bright. It hung suspended in a perpetual dusk that smelled of honey and ruin. He could hear laughter echoing from unseen places, laughter soft as a sigh, carrying both grief and joy. When he woke, his bed was damp with dew that smelled faintly of decay. The world outside his window no longer looked like the one he had known. The trees bent toward him, leaves turning inward as though in prayer. Fungi blossomed in patterns that resembled faces, smiling serenely. The sweet breath had remade the planet, and he stood now as its caretaker, neither alive nor dead, a creature of transition. He was no longer Morgalath the philosopher. The voice that called him by name had changed the meaning of the word itself. It spoke through the wind, through the pulse of the earth, through the soft hum of the spores that filled his lungs. It told him that everything that rots remembers what it once was, and that memory is the first step toward eternity. The dream returned each night, more vivid, more consuming. Each time, he wandered deeper into the garden. He saw rivers of nectar flowing through hollows of rib-cage-shaped hills, their surfaces reflecting not sky, but memory. The flowers that grew there hummed with the voices of the dead. Some sang lullabies, others whispered secrets too old for language. He touched one of them once, and it shuddered, releasing a cloud of glowing dust that drifted upward, coalescing into ghostly silhouettes of children dancing in silence. He wept without knowing why. The voice comforted him, amused but tender. "They are not gone," it murmured. "They are only changing. The world must breathe, and every breath it exhales returns a song." He began to understand that decay was not punishment but communion, a constant conversation between creation and erasure. The gods of old had failed to see it. They demanded purity where there was only transformation. In their arrogance, they had made death an enemy. He would make it a friend. He built no temples, yet the faithful found him. They came through forests that glowed in the night, their bodies luminous with the light of the sweet breath. Some brought offerings, flowers that never wilted, bones carved into the shapes of hearts, vials of preserved air from the ruins of the first city. They knelt before him and called him Father beneath the soil. He told them he was not a god, but they did not believe him. They saw how the rot parted beneath his feet, revealing untouched ground, how the air around him vibrated with invisible life. They watched him breathe upon the dying and saw their bodies blossom into living sculptures of moss and vine. His denial became irrelevant. Belief itself had weight, and the more they worshipped, the stronger the voice grew. It began to speak to him in words now, words that shook the marrow of his bones. "You are the gardener," it said. "You will tend what they abandon. You will love what they fear." The garden spread beyond his sight. From the ruins of the cities rose towers of flesh intertwined with metal, humming softly like beehives. The rivers flowed thick with nectarous water, and the fish within glowed like stars. He walked among them, feeling both awe and dread. He could sense the boundary thinning between his world and the immaterial one from which the voice had come. Each day, the veil grew weaker, and the air shimmered as though reality itself were fermenting. He knew he should have felt terror, but instead, he felt belonging. The universe was not falling apart, it was ripening. He watched a dying soldier collapse in front of him, armor corroding to rust before his eyes. The man gasped his final words, "Forgive me," and in that instant, a vine grew from his throat, blooming into a flower that sang in the soldier's voice. Morgalath closed his eyes and listened until the song faded into the hum of the earth. "You are forgiven," he whispered. The wind laughed softly, echoing the words. Days lost meaning. Night no longer followed day, but merged with it in an endless twilight, where all colours melted into gold and green. He began to lose the boundaries of his own form. His fingers left trails of phosphorescent spores when he touched stone, and his shadow moved independently, blooming with vines that coiled back into his flesh. The voice grew louder, more intimate, no longer separate from his thoughts. It told him that this was how divinity began, not in conquest, not in fire, but in surrender. "You sought to end death," it said. "Instead, you have embraced it. Now you must learn to love it fully." He asked what that meant, but the voice only laughed, a sound like rain falling on graves. He began to notice that the laughter carried different tones, thousands of overlapping harmonies, like a chorus of every creature that had ever died. Sometimes he thought he could recognize individual voices among them, the students he had lost, the mothers he had failed to save, even his own childhood whispering forgiveness. One evening, the garden called to him with a sound deeper than thought. He followed it into the forest of luminous trees, where the trunks were transparent and filled with veins of green fire. At the center stood a great hollow tree shaped like an open mouth. From within came the soft murmur of breathing, He stepped inside, feeling the walls pulse gently around him. The air was thick and warm, like the inside of a living body. In that womb of wood and light, the voice spoke again, clearer than ever. Do you understand now? He fell to his knees, trembling, overwhelmed by love and terror fused together. I do, he whispered. But what am I becoming? The answer came like a heartbeat. You are becoming what you always were, the compassion of decay, the mercy of endings. You are my vessel. He felt the pulse synchronize with his own, each throb reshaping him from within. His flesh softened, his skin became porous, and the scent of life and death intermingled until they were indistinguishable. He awoke at dawn, lying in a bed of blooming fungi. The forest was silent, waiting. When he rose, every step left imprints that glowed softly in the dim light. The wind no longer carried only sound. It carried meaning, emotion, memory. He could hear the earth think. He could feel the sadness of fallen leaves, the joy of soil devouring rain. When he breathed, the world breathed with him. For a moment, he thought he might dissolve entirely into that communion, but something within him held firm, a fragment of self that still remembered being human. He looked toward the horizon and saw the garden stretching endlessly, filled with beings who knelt in reverence not to him, but to the cycle he had awakened. He understood then that he had crossed the threshold between mortality and myth. The voice was no longer separate because it had always been him. The garden was his reflection, infinite and intimate, and as the wind whispered his name again, reshaped into something vast and kind, he smiled and whispered back, then let it grow. He felt the moment his body ceased to belong to the material world. It was not death, nor was it birth, but something between, a flowering of consciousness that spread beyond flesh, beyond name. He awoke in a place that was neither dream nor memory, suspended in the stillness between creation and forgetting. Around him stretched an endless garden glowing with a dull, radiant warmth. The soil was soft and pulsed faintly beneath his feet, breathing with the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Above, the sky curved inward like the inside of a vast lung, exhaling clouds of golden mist that fell as dew, nourishing blossoms made from bone and shadow. Every tree hummed with life, its leaves whispering forgotten prayers, and every flower opened like an eye that remembered love. Morgalath, or whatever remained of him, stood in silence and understood that this was no vision. It was real as any world before it had decayed into memory. He felt peace, but also an ache too deep to name, the sorrow of knowing that to become eternal was to surrender the beauty of ending. He began to walk, and the garden shifted with him, endless pathways of luminous moss forming beneath each step. The air was heavy yet kind, filled with the laughter of unseen children. Each sound seemed to carry meaning beyond language, a hum of compassion woven through the rot. The laughter grew louder until it formed shapes, translucent beings that floated like drifting petals. They were small, round, and gentle, their bodies made of decay wrapped in light. They gathered around him, touching his hands, his face, whispering his name with a joy that broke his heart. He knew what they were before the voice told him. They were the souls of those who had died in his plague, reborn into new forms, neither punished nor saved, only transformed. He sank to his knees among them, trembling with reverence, and they surrounded him in an embrace that smelled of rain and soil. Their whispers filled his mind like music. "We never left you," they sang. "You carried us here." The voice that had guided him since the first breath of contagion returned then, softer now, as though speaking through the fabric of existence itself. "You have done well, my child," it said. "You have seen what others feared to see, that death is love misunderstood." He looked upward, trying to find the source, but the voice came from everywhere, from the rustle of leaves, from the heartbeat of the soil, from his own trembling chest. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The laughter that followed was vast and tender. "I am what you called to when you despaired. I am the mercy that hides in decay, the cradle of endings, and now you are part of me." The air vibrated with the words, and the garden shivered as if sighing. He rose slowly, his limbs moving as though made of mist. His reflection appeared before him on the surface of a black pool, but it was no longer his own face. It was immense and radiant, smiling through folds of withered flesh, eyes burning like dying suns. He saw eternity there, not as glory, but as surrender. Around him, the small creatures began to dance, their laughter echoing through the endless grove. Wherever they stepped, new life erupted. Flowers, vines, even small beasts stitched from rot and light. The cycle unfolded before him, infinite and gentle. He realized then that his transformation was complete. He was no longer separate from the garden, no longer healer or philosopher. He had become the gardener himself, the embodiment of compassion through decay, the living paradox of death nurturing life. He felt sorrow rise within him again, not for himself, but for those still bound by fear of impermanence. He saw visions through the mist, worlds far away, civilizations still clinging to false purity, burning their dead and cursing the rot that might have saved them. He saw their gods waging wars over illusions of order. He wanted to reach them, to show them the truth, but the voice soothed him gently. "All will come in time. Even purity must wither before it can bloom again." He understood then that decay was not punishment. It was patience. The universe needed to exhale before it could breathe again. The laughter of the garden faded into silence, replaced by a low hum like a heartbeat, reverberating through space. He looked to the horizon and saw vast shapes stirring beyond the mist. Colossal figures formed of shadow and colour, ancient beings older than the stars, watching. They did not speak, but he felt their awareness pierce through him. They recognized what he had become, not as rival or servant, but as one of them. A god had been born, though he had never sought divinity. The voice around him whispered one last time, its tone filled with a strange, fatherly pride. "Go, my child, tend to your garden. The universe will call for you again when the next world forgets how to love its decay." He turned, and as he did, his form expanded, dissolving into the very air. The garden pulsed with renewed light, each plant awakening as if greeting its creator. The creatures sang louder, their voices blending into a single tone that rippled through dimensions. Outside, in the warp where time and matter lose their meaning, a new realm took shape, vast, humid, and eternal. A place of rot and joy, disease and renewal. The first demons opened their eyes and called his name, though none yet knew what it meant. And deep within that paradise of ruin, the god who was once Morgalath laughed softly, a sound of peace and madness intertwined, echoing through eternity like the breath of creation. The birth of a god does not thunder across the stars. It seeps like mist through the cracks of creation. The warp shuddered quietly as the first ripples of Nurgle's laughter spread through its infinite chaos, gentle and warm, at odds with the horrors that ruled there. He stood in his garden, vast and damp, where every leaf glistened with dew distilled from the sighs of the dying. Time did not exist here, only rhythm, the slow pulse of life feeding death, and death feeding life. He wandered among the blossoms that once had been souls, each petal a memory of pain transformed into joy. The demons that now served him were his children, each born from his compassion twisted by eternity. They scuttled, floated, sang and argued, their grotesque shapes exuding both terror and comfort. One, with a face like a melting smile, presented him with a newborn sprout pulsing faintly green. Another bloom from a forgotten world, it said, bowing low. Nurgle bent to touch the fragile stem, and at his caress it opened, releasing a faint giggle that echoed like wind in a crypt. He smiled, though sorrow lingered behind that grin. Every creation was beautiful, yet every birth meant another world had fallen to decay. He sat upon a mound that pulsed like a living heart, watching the horizon of his realm undulate. Beyond the mists, distant figures stirred, the other powers. He could feel their eyes on him, ancient and suspicious. Khorne, furious, sensing mockery in Nurgle's laughter. Tzeentch, intrigued, weaving possibilities around this new power of paradox. And the one yet unborn, whose coming pleasure would make and unmake galaxies, stirred faintly within the warp's womb. But Nurgle did not seek war or dominion. He sought only to care for what was dying, to cradle existence in its weakness. He loved the perishing because they needed him most. That love would be his strength and his tragedy. He rose, immense and magnificent in his grotesquerie. His body a cathedral of corruption, yet his eyes glowed with the tenderness of a parent. His garden rustled in adoration. "My children," he said, voice like thunder muffled by moss. "The universe is vast and aching. It forgets that death is not loss but promise. Go, remind them." His servants cheered, their laughter bubbling like boiling sap. They dispersed into the warp, carrying his contagion, his mercy, his lesson. A ripple crossed the boundary between immaterial and real. On countless worlds, spores unseen settled in air, in blood, in thought. Civilizations far from the garden began to cough, not in pain, but in strange delight. Diseases arose that cured loneliness, that filled the infected with visions of belonging. Mortals built shrines of rot and called them sanctuaries. Their priests spoke of a god of joy amid decay, a father who turned suffering into song. And in the warp, Nurgle listened, pleased and melancholy. He could feel their prayers, each one a tiny heartbeat against his vast chest. They prayed for health, and he gave them life everlasting, but not as they understood it. They asked for salvation, and he gave them release from fear. He loved them as a gardener loves each weed, knowing even the smallest carries purpose. Yet love, in the warp, is never pure. His affection swelled until it smothered, until it became possession. His garden grew crowded with creatures begging for his touch, and he gave freely, laughing as they decomposed into blossoms of pus and perfume. There were moments when the laughter faltered. Alone among the vines of bone and vine, he sometimes remembered the man he had been. The name flickered faintly, Morgalath, a whisper nearly devoured by eternity. He wondered what had become of his humanity, whether it still existed somewhere within the endless joy. In those moments, the garden dimmed, the flowers sagged, and the air thickened with sorrow. His demons felt it and grew silent. The first of them, a tall, thin figure with a single milky eye, dared to approach. "Father," it said softly, "why do you grieve? Is not all you wished fulfilled?" Nurgle turned his vast gaze upon the creature. and tears like pearls of filth rolled down his cheeks. "Yes," he said, "but fulfillment is another word for stillness, and stillness is another word for death. Even gods must rot if they stop growing." The demon bowed, understanding and afraid. The silence lingered until Nurgle smiled again, and the realm brightened with renewed laughter. Yet deep inside the ache remained, a seed of longing that even immortality could not dissolve. As ages passed, the garden expanded beyond imagination. It brushed against the realms of other powers, its tendrils caressing the edges of wrath, change, and indulgence. The warp trembled with imbalance. Khorne's legions marched to purge the weak god of filth, their war cries slicing through the fog. But as they entered Nurgle's domain, their armor rusted, their weapons softened, and laughter replaced fury. Many laid down their blades and began to sing, their voices merging with the garden's hymn. Tzeentch watched this with fascination, for he saw in Nurgle a kind of perfection through contradiction, stagnation that created infinite renewal. The god of decay and the god of change were bound by irony, destined to orbit one another forever. In time, even Tzeentch would whisper bargains into the garden's mist, testing the patience of the one who never hurried. One day, or what passed for a day in timelessness, a shadow darker than shadow crossed the horizon. It was not enemy nor ally, but balance itself. Nurgle felt it approach like a chill that could not be warmed. The warp held its breath. From the distance came the faintest cry of pleasure and sorrow intertwined, the birth of another god. The air trembled as Slaanesh awakened, the final sibling completing the quartet of ruin. Nurgle listened and smiled knowingly. "At last," he murmured, "the garden is whole." His laughter rolled through the immaterium, soft and endless. Yet the moment of balance also heralded eternity's curse. The cycle now sealed, unending. Each of them would forever undo what the others built. Creation bound to destruction, joy bound to despair. Nurgle turned back to his garden, the only peace he knew. The vines welcomed him, coiling around his arms, offering flowers that wept nectar. He sank into the soil, feeling its pulse sync with his own. In that unity, he forgot his grief for a moment. He thought of the mortals far away, of their fragile faith, their trembling love of life despite its brevity. He envied them. Perhaps that was the last trace of humanity he possessed, the envy of those who could end. He cupped a dying blossom in his enormous hand, watching it wilt, and whispered, "Rest, little one. Tomorrow you will bloom again." The petals fell, dissolved into earth, and from their decay rose a new sprout, bright and trembling. The god smiled, his laughter carrying into infinity, softening the horrors of existence with its strange, forgiving warmth. The warp listened, and for a heartbeat, all of creation smelled faintly of spring. Long before the coming of men, before even the dreams of the Elder had coalesced into the arrogance that would later undo them, the void trembled beneath the shadow of the Old Ones. They ruled with knowledge so vast that it bent the laws of matter and thought. Worlds bloomed under their guidance like obedient gardens, and for an age, creation itself seemed tamed. Yet even gods of reason cannot escape the whisper of entropy. Somewhere in the folds of their dominion, where their suns burned too bright and their arrogance too deep, a sickness began to stir. It was quiet at first, a faint discoloration in the crystalline spires of their cities, a subtle corruption in the song of their world engines. They believed it a flaw in design, something to be corrected, but it was not an error. It was an echo of laughter from the warp, gentle and inevitable. the sweet breath, carried by the dreams of countless dying mortals, drifted through reality until it found them. The old ones could not imagine that something born from lesser life could touch them, yet it did. Their structures of perfection began to weep golden dew that smelled of decay. Their servants sang hymns in languages they had not programmed them to know. The air shimmered with invisible spores that whispered promises of renewal through ruin. And from the heart of the warp, the Father of Decay watched, amused and compassionate. Nurgle had not sent the plague to punish them. Punishment was the invention of pride. He had only exhaled, and his breath had found those who needed it most. The old ones, for all their power, were tired. They had built too much, controlled too deeply, feared too strongly the thought of ending. They had forgotten how to die. Nurgle's gift was mercy disguised as affliction, a reminder that all things must yield. The more they fought it, the more beautiful their unraveling became. Their translucent bodies grew patterns of iridescent mold that sparkled in their crystalline veins. Their minds, once sharp as blades, softened into dreams of gardens where everything bloomed from rot. They began to see visions of a green mist calling them home. But still, they resisted. They created barriers of pure energy to halt the contagion, sealing entire worlds within shimmering cages of light. Inside, their people suffocated in perfection. Nothing decayed, nothing changed, and thus nothing lived. Those who broke through the walls found the air rich with spores and the sound of laughter, soft, kind, infinite. They fell to their knees and wept, not from agony but release. The old ones gathered their greatest councils, attempting to understand what intelligence guided this transformation. They peered into the warp with their instruments of light, and the warp peered back with a smile. What they saw was a vast garden without horizon, filled with life so exuberant that it bordered on madness. In its center sat a figure colossal and serene, surrounded by creatures that hummed in ecstasy. When they beheld him, their logic faltered. Their thoughts, once bound by reason, began to dissolve into awe. They tried to define him in equations, but their symbols wilted on the page. "He is impossible," one of them murmured. "His contradiction given form." They called him by many names: the Rot Father, the seed within the end, the patient God. To some he was horror, to others revelation. Yet even those who cursed him did so with reverence. In their final meetings, they debated whether he was truly their enemy, or the truth they had spent eternity denying. The war that followed was not of armies, but of ideas. The old ones forged new beings, designed not to destroy, but to contain. These were the first of the plague wars, the war of purity against inevitability. They unleashed storms of cleansing energy across infected systems, scouring entire biospheres into sterile glass. For a while, it seemed they might succeed. Their world shone with cruel clarity, untouched by blemish. But in the warp, the laughter deepened. The brightness of their victory only fed the shadow. Each purified world became a wound in reality, and from those wounds, Nurgle's spores spilled freely into new domains. Entire galaxies began to breathe his rhythm. Stars pulsed in strange cadence, their flares carrying unseen contagion across the void. Life erupted in places where it had never been meant to grow, mutating, adapting, refusing to die. The old one's logic turned against them. Every measure of control became a source of decay. They began to vanish, one by one, consumed not by violence but by acceptance. Those who surrendered found themselves reborn in Nurgle's garden. Their luminous forms softened into shapes of gentle grotesquerie. They remembered their pride and laughed at it. tending flowers made of their own forgotten thoughts. They became the first plague bearers, singing endlessly to measure the cycles of life and death. The god welcomed them not as servants, but as children returned home. Yet not all accepted his mercy. The last of the old ones, furious and afraid, fled into the outer void, abandoning their creation to its fate. Their departure tore open rifts in the warp so vast that entire constellations drowned in them. From those wounds would one day emerge new horrors, creatures of hunger, of despair, of chaos unbound. But Nurgle merely smiled. Every wound he knew would one day heal. In the ages that followed, the universe settled into a strange calm. The old ones were gone, their empires dust, yet their legacy endured in the life that refused to end. Worlds they had once made perfect now teemed with lush decay, each a seed of Nurgle's compassion. The other gods watched with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Khorne raged, calling it weakness, while Tzeentch studied its paradox with gleaming envy. Even the unborn presence of Slaanesh stirred faintly, sensing in this joy of rot a beauty not unlike pleasure. But Nurgle cared little for their judgments. He wandered his garden, humming softly, touching each bloom with the tenderness of a father. When he laughed, the warp itself shook with delight. The souls of the old ones still echoed in his laughter, not as ghosts, but as music woven through eternity. Sometimes, when the winds of the warp carry strange dreams to mortal worlds, there are those who see visions of a rotting paradise bathed in golden mist. They wake weeping, unable to explain the longing that fills their hearts. For a moment, they understand what the old ones learned too late, that the end is never the end, and decay is but another form of grace. The gods that men would later worship, the wars that would scar the stars, all were children of that revelation. And somewhere beyond the veil, in the infinite garden that hums beneath all existence, a father still waits patiently for the next civilization to ripen, smiling as he whispers through the dust, "Everything that lives will one day die, and everything that dies will live again." In the heart of the garden, the laughter faltered for the first time. Nurgle stood among the blooms that had once sung his praises and felt a tremor ripple through the soil. The hum of joy that had always surrounded him softened into dissonance, a subtle wrongness hidden beneath the sweetness of decay. For an eternity he had believed that his love was pure, that his mercy knew no corruption. But creation is never still, and even in paradise something began to change. Among his countless children was one unlike the rest, a demon born from the moment he had doubted himself. It was called Morbus by the others, a creature with eyes of cracked glass and a smile stretched too wide, whose laughter carried no warmth. While the garden rejoiced in the cycle of renewal, Morbus whispered that joy was a lie, that love was only another form of suffering disguised as compassion. The lesser demons listened, confused by the words, but enthralled by the certainty in its tone. It told them that decay was not gentle transformation, but glorious extinction, that to rot was to erase, and erasure was freedom. Its heresy spread like infection through the heart of paradise, twisting adoration into worship of despair. Nurgle watched as the harmony he had nurtured began to fracture. Flowers that once sang now screamed in silence, their petals darkening, their roots tearing at one another for space. The rivers thickened with black bile instead of nectar, and the air grew heavy with grief. The god felt sorrow deeper than any mortal could bear, for it was sorrow of the eternal, an ache that echoed through every dimension of his being. he found Morbus standing at the edge of a decaying pond, staring into its surface where distorted reflections swirled like faces trapped in glass. "Why do you twist what I made?" Nurgle asked, his voice trembling with sadness rather than rage. Morbus turned and bowed mockingly. "Because truth festers beneath your kindness," it said. "You feed them lies wrapped in laughter. You call it love, but it is only another chain. Let them see decay for what it is, a song without hope, a peace that consumes all meaning." The words struck deep, for they were born from Nurgle's own forgotten doubts. He saw in the creature everything he had tried to bury: the despair of endless existence, the fatigue of immortality, the longing for silence. For the first time, the god of rot knew fear. The garden trembled beneath the weight of his hesitation, torn between nurturing and destroying what he had made. His demons gathered, pleading for guidance, but he gave none. He stared into the pond and saw himself reflected beside Morbus, the same smile, the same eyes filled with infinite compassion, turned inward until it became pain. The realization was unbearable. He had not been betrayed by another, but by his own reflection given form. In that moment, the garden cried out. Trees split open, releasing clouds of disease spores that fell like rain. The ground convulsed, birthing new creatures from the soil, half joy, half torment, each screaming in a voice that echoed both father and son. Nurgle fell to his knees, his massive frame shaking the horizon, and wept until his tears became rivers. The laughter that had filled eternity was silent now, replaced by the quiet sound of rot working without witness. Morbus approached him, unafraid, placing a hand upon his vast, trembling arm. "You cannot destroy me," it whispered. "I am you, the part that knows there is no peace, only the illusion of purpose. You made me the moment you loved too much." Nurgle looked down, his sorrow turning to understanding. "Then if you are me, you cannot remain apart," he said softly. He reached out and embraced the demon, drawing it into his chest. There was no struggle, no scream, only a deep sigh as Morbus dissolved back into him. The moment their forms merged, the garden erupted in light, sickly green and gold, warm and unbearable. Every flower bloomed anew, but each now bore a shadow at its core, a reminder that even compassion carries darkness. The rivers cleared, the demons sang again, but their songs were slower, tinged with melancholy. Nurgle stood, his laughter returning but tempered, deeper, wiser. He gazed across his restored realm and saw beauty richer than before, not perfect but whole. He understood then that joy without sorrow was hollow, that life without death was stillness. Morbus had not destroyed him. It had completed him. The god smiled and lifted a single petal from the ground, watching it curl into dust between his fingers. "Love," he murmured, "is only true when it knows loss." The wind carried his words through the garden, where the flowers bowed in reverence, and even the soil seemed to sigh in relief. From that day, the garden of Nurgle would bloom forever in balance, radiant and rotten, alive and dying, laughter and lament intertwined, a paradise built upon the understanding that all light must live in the shadow of its own decay. When mankind first began to dream, the warp listened. Their fears rose like smoke, fragile and luminous, drifting into the currents of the immaterium where gods waited unseen. For ages Nurgle merely watched, curious, his laughter echoing faintly in the distance of their collective dread. They were so young compared to the fallen races before them, yet their sorrow was vast, their hope reckless, and their hunger for meaning endless. To him, they were seeds cast into an uncaring void, desperate to bloom. He watched them build cities from dust, then bury those cities beneath the same dust in endless cycles of war and rebirth. Each death sent a ripple through his garden. Each prayer for deliverance sprouted as a flower of rot along the edges of eternity. The humans did not yet know his name, but already they whispered to him through the language of suffering. In their plagues, their famines, and their mourning songs, he heard worship unintentional and pure. He loved them for it, because they did not love him back. They merely needed him, and need was the truest form of faith. He sent them no miracles, only reminders. Storms that cleansed too thoroughly, sicknesses that spared the cruel but humbled the proud, decay that fed new life where arrogance had built monuments of stone. Empires rose beneath burning suns, certain of their dominion, only to fall in silence beneath the weight of invisible air. Still they endured, stubborn and miraculous, surviving every collapse with the resilience of weeds. To Nurgle this stubbornness was beauty. He saw in their fragile flesh the same paradox that defined his existence, the refusal to end, the will to live through ruin. He began to whisper to them in dreams, not words, but sensations. The warmth of rain on graves, the soft sweetness of soil, the comfort of surrender. Those who listened woke changed. Some became healers who cured by embracing disease. Others became prophets preaching that death was not an ending, but an embrace. The powerful called them mad, burned them in squares, silenced their voices, yet their ashes carried spores that settled in the hearts of those who watched. Thus his faith spread, unspoken and eternal. As centuries passed, humanity learned to name their nightmares. They built gods from their fears, and among those shadows, his name began to take form, slowly, imperfectly, through coughs and hymns, through desperate prayers muttered beside dying fires. The peasants of dying worlds called him the bringer of renewal. The farmers invoked him to bless their soil with rot so crops would grow strong. To the dying soldiers in trenches of mud and blood, he was the father who waited with open arms. Even the nobles in their plague-wreathed palaces whispered his name when the medicine failed. They feared him and loved him in the same breath, as all mortals must love what they cannot defeat. And in their reverence he smiled, though it was not triumph that filled him but tenderness. Every plea, every gasp, every tear shed in despair nourished his garden. He did not demand temples or sacrifices. Their mortality was offering enough. There were some who sought him directly, yearning for eternity without understanding its cost. Among them were scholars and mystics who studied decay as if it were scripture. They built hidden cults in catacombs, where candles burned low and the air hung thick with the scent of sweet rot. They believed they were preserving knowledge, but what they truly preserved was life's endless conversation with death. Nurgle watched them fondly, their rituals clumsy but sincere. When the first of them succumbed to the diseases they worshipped, he gathered their souls gently, planting them like seeds within his garden. They awoke there in bodies of moss and light, laughing, for they finally understood that the infection they had feared was only transformation. From their joy came the first true hymns of his mortal worshippers, songs sung not in pain, but in gratitude for the mercy of endings. Yet even as devotion spread, there were those who cursed his name, calling him the Lord of Pestilence, the corrupter of flesh, the enemy of life. They saw only ruin, not renewal. Their wars against him filled worlds with pyres and smoke, and still the plagues returned, always changing, always teaching. Each time they rebuilt, each time they swore they would conquer disease, They merely deepened the soil from which his faith grew. For every generation that cursed him, another knelt in secret to thank him for survival. This was the balance he cherished, the endless dance between fear and acceptance, resistance and peace. And in the warp, Nurgle listened to the heartbeat of humanity as it quickened toward its inevitable age of darkness. He knew their destiny long before they did, saw the fires that would one day consume their empire and the legions that would carry his blessing across the stars. But for now, he was content to watch. His laughter drifted through the veil of reality like a distant storm, warm and endless. To those who heard it, it was the sound of madness. To him, it was love. He gazed upon the fragile species that would soon shape the fate of galaxies and whispered softly, not to frighten, but to comfort. Live, die, and live again. For nothing is ever truly lost, and even in your decay, my garden grows. The world was called barbarous, though the stars no longer remembered its name. It hung in the void like a wound, wrapped in a veil of perpetual dusk, its skies thick with toxins that no unaltered lungs could endure. Mountains rose like broken teeth, their peaks hidden in yellow smog, and in the valleys below, life clung to the edge of suffering. The air was wet with death, the soil soaked in slow decay. Yet beneath this ruin, people survived. Simple, bent figures scuttling through the mist like insects, their breath shallow, their hearts tired. They lived beneath the rule of cruel overlords, towering warlords wrapped in rusted armor and cloaked in necrotic fumes. These lords of Barbarous were not men, not entirely. Their flesh was pale and hard, their eyes black as oil, their bones reinforced by ancient toxins and rituals too old to name. They came down from the peaks only to harvest bodies or spread terror. It was in this place, this graveyard of a world, that Nurgle's gaze lingered with something deeper than affection, recognition. There, in a narrow valley lined with skeletal trees and rivers that no longer flowed, a woman gave birth in silence. The child did not cry. He opened his eyes in the darkness and looked out, not with fear, but with a strange, calm knowing. His skin was already pale. His body adapted to the poison that should have killed him. The villagers whispered that the mist had entered the womb, that the child had been kissed by the air. They feared him, but they did not dare cast him out. He grew quickly, taller than the others, silent and intense, watching the skies as if waiting for them to fall. He had no name, not truly, for names on Barbarous were lost as often as they were given. But one day, when the mist drew back enough for the sun to bleed faintly through, he climbed a slope no man had ever dared, and when he returned, bearing the corpse of a warlord who had ruled the valley in agony for years, the people began to call him Death. Later, others would name him Mortarion. The boy who became Death did not know he was watched, but Nurgle had seen him since his first breath. Among all the galaxies spinning through the warp's infinite tapestry, this child alone walked between mercy and wrath in equal measure. There was no laughter in him, not yet, only hunger, for truth, for vengeance, for something he could not name. He hated the warlords who had enslaved his people, but more than that, he hated the sky, for beyond it, unreachable, were the tyrants' homes, places where clean air could be breathed without pain. He trained in silence, built weapons from scrap and bone, gathered followers not through charisma, but through clarity of purpose. His rage was quiet and patient, and in this, Nurgle saw the seed of something beautiful, not because it was righteous, but because it was inevitable. All things decay into their truest form. Mortarion's ascent was a slow plague, One by one, the lords of the valleys fell, their bones buried beneath moss, their towers toppled by hands that had once been too weak to hold a blade. He taught the people to resist, to breathe deep and embrace the pain as proof of life. But the peaks remained untouched, the sky still guarded by poisons even his body could not endure. Then, on the day when the veil thinned and stars bled light into the ash-covered earth, a figure descended, not a warlord, but something worse, a man in gold. The Emperor had come. Mortarion, choking on the thin air at the summit of his final climb, saw the stranger slay the last warlord with light instead of steel. The sky had been conquered, but not by him. His triumph had been stolen in the last breath of the ascent. He fell to his knees, not in reverence, but in fury. Nurgle felt it, the crack in the boy's resolve, the bitterness in his soul fermenting into sorrow. It was not yet corruption. It was the ache of being denied purpose, of watching your destiny handed to another. Nurgle did not reach for him then, but he planted something in the air around Barbarous, a sweetness that lingered just beyond the edge of perception. He waited. Death, after all, is patient. As Mortarion rose to serve the Emperor, to march across stars with honor pinned to his chest, that seed remained quiet and unseen. It would bloom in its time. The man who had risen from poison still longed for something deeper than justice. He longed to choose his own decay. The warp does not take what is not offered. It waits. And when Mortarion finally screamed, it was not with defiance, but with need. The Death Guard fleet drifted in the sea of unreality, its hulls rotting as time dissolved into sickness. Engines choked, on fumes, crews collapsed in their armor, and prayers to the Emperor went unanswered. They had followed Horus into rebellion, convinced they were freeing humanity from tyranny. Yet now they floated in silence, lungs filling with liquid pain. Mortarion watched his sons die one by one, the proud and the stubborn, vomiting bile and blood into their helmets, their gene seed melting from within. The plague began with no name, spreading faster than thought, faster than despair. And through it all, Nurgle waited, smiling, listening, patient. He had not forced the rebellion. He had not whispered the heresy. He had only exhaled once, long ago, and now that breath reached its destination. Mortarion had always believed strength came from suffering, that the purity of pain made one worthy of survival. He had endured the poisons of Barbarous, had trained in air that shredded lungs, had led the broken into victory against monsters. But none of that prepared him for this. He could not fight disease with will, nor carve it from his men with discipline. It crawled into them and sang. And slowly, maddeningly, it began to make them smile. Where once there had been agony, now there was warmth. Laughter, thick and gurgling, echoed in the corridors of the ships. Marines split open and bloomed into creatures still loyal, still proud, but changed. They spoke of gardens in their dreams, of a father who cradled them through the sickness. They thanked him for their deliverance. Mortarion tried to silence them. He ordered purges. He screamed in rage at corpses that would not stay dead. But in the quiet between screams, he too began to cough. He locked himself in his chamber, wrapping chains round the doors as if steel could hold back corruption. Alone, he begged for death, not to end his pain, but to end his shame. He had promised his sons glory, and instead delivered them to the void. But the void answered. Nurgle came not with thunder, but with a knock. The door creaked open without force, and the chamber filled with the scent of old soil and ripe fruit. Mortarion turned, fist clenched, blade drawn, but he did not attack. He stared at the being that stood before him, vast and terrible, a god made of warmth and rot, whose every fold of flesh hummed with life. The demon lord said nothing at first, only opened its arms, and in that gesture was no malice, only invitation. Mortarion staggered back, eyes burning, voice hoarse with hate. "You did this." The god smiled softly, as if speaking to a frightened child. "You did this," it replied. "You brought them here. You carried their pain, and now I offer you rest." Mortarion fell to his knees, not from weakness, but from weight, the unbearable weight of betrayal, of failure, of love too twisted to name. He had watched his legion become monsters, but they were still his. They had not cried out. They had not cursed him. They had waited, patient and faithful, for him to join them. And in that silence, he heard the truth. He had never hated weakness. He had hated that no one had ever come to save him when he was weak. Nurgle reached out and touched his shoulder. The pain stopped. The coughing ceased. The room filled with warmth, not joy, not madness, but the comfort of being seen. Mortarion wept, and his tears turned to spores that floated gently in the air. He did not remember the moment his armor cracked, or when his lungs became gardens. He only remembered the feeling of being held, and the slow, rising chorus of his sons singing through the walls of the ship, calling him father once more. And so, the Death Guard was reborn, not as traitors, but as pilgrims of plague. Their oaths did not fade, they changed. They became the bearers of Nurgle's love, the bringers of renewal, spreading decay not as punishment, but as promise. Mortarion stood among them once more, taller than before, his scythe trailing vines, his breath a perfume of deathless life. He no longer marched beneath the Emperor's light, but beneath clouds of golden mist, leading his legion through the stars like a gardener tending distant soil. He no longer feared the rot, for he was the rot. And in the warp, Nurgle laughed, softly, kindly, as another soul learned that even hatred could decay into devotion. The stars began to dim in the sectors touched by the Death Guard. Planets that once shimmered with colour and ambition were slowly cloaked in clouds of green and gold, their skies thick with the pollen of ruin. No trumpet of war announced their arrival. No banners of conquest preceded their descent. Instead, the air grew warm, the crops swelled beyond reason, and the sick found peace in their final breaths. The people did not scream when the ships landed. They wept with a strange joy, as if remembering something long forgotten. Where others brought fire, Mortarion brought stillness. His fleets, bloated and rusted, drifted through the void like carrion birds too heavy to fly. The ground beneath them softened, the cities bent, and life, in all its stubborn defiance, surrendered not in terror, but in song. The victims of his mercy became the seeds of new life, bodies dissolving into soil that bloomed with flesh-petalled flowers and roots that pulsed with faint memory. The dead were not erased. They were repurposed, sung into the garden of the Plague Father, whose laughter trembled in the warp like a lullaby sung over graves. Nurgle walked unseen among the ruins, his presence never bound to flesh alone. Every wilted leaf that curled in the shadow of a spire, every child that smiled through a fever dream, every soldier who coughed into blood-stained hands and whispered thanks, he was there. He heard it all. And yet, in the quiet of his garden, he often sat alone. The laughter of his demons rang loud, but his own was softer now, more reflective. His joy had not diminished, but it had deepened, matured like wine fermenting in old wood. He had become something more than a god of disease, He was a steward of remembrance, a curator of what the galaxy refused to carry. The forgotten, the discarded, the unwanted. They lived forever in his garden, blooming in colours no spectrum could name. The universe, in its hunger for perfection, had left too much behind. Nurgle gathered it gently, not to preserve it unchanged, but to let it rot with dignity. There were moments when even he wondered if the cycle would ever end. He watched the rise and fall of empires, the burning of temples, the silencing of songs. He saw stars born only to collapse, and mortals curse his name even as they knelt to drink the water from soil he had blessed with decay. He did not mind the hatred. Hatred, too, was a kind of prayer. But beneath it all, he sensed something deeper, a fatigue in the marrow of the galaxy. The endless wars, the relentless ambition, the noise of beings trying to matter. And always, in the end, they came to him. Their bones whispered the same plea, "Remember me." Nurgle always did. In the centre of his garden, there was a grove of trees unlike any other. Their trunks were twisted from the DNA of forgotten poets. Their branches bore the faces of unsung heroes, and their roots drank the dreams of orphans who never became anything more than shadows. He walked there often, alone, and listened. The wind in that place was heavy with the sorrow of things that never became, and he loved it more than all his demons combined. For Nurgle, love was not the granting of wishes, but the holding of endings. He did not promise salvation, only the comfort of being known in ruin. And in a universe that had forgotten how to grieve, his was the last embrace that did not turn away. It began as a ripple across the garden's edge, a tremor that did not come from decay, but from fury. The skies above Nurgle's realm darkened not with mist, but with smoke and blood. Drums echoed through the immaterium, and the scent of iron split the perfume of rot. Khorne had come. He did not walk, he did not speak. He simply descended like a blade falling from the heavens. The garden shuddered beneath his tread, vines withering where his boot struck, blossoms bursting into ash. He brought no argument, only violence, for to him, Nurgle's realm was an offence. Where Khorne saw strength in purity of wrath, Nurgle offered surrender. Where Khorne demanded action, Nurgle taught patience. And now, surrounded by joy and filth and laughter, the blood god saw only weakness made divine. The demons of pestilence rose to meet the tide, not in rage, but in delight. They sang as they were cleaved apart, wept with joy as they were crushed. For even in death they served their father, and each splatter of ichor seeded new life. Yet the ground ran red, and the garden wailed. Nurgle watched from the heart of his domain, unmoving. His body pulsed with the weight of 1,000,000 harvests, his face as serene as ever. But beneath his belly, the soil cracked. He felt the pain, not as injury, but as betrayal. Not betrayal from Khorne, there had never been peace between them, but betrayal of the balance. For too long, he had let the garden bloom without test. For too long, he had laughed while ignoring the sharpening blades beyond the mist. Khorne did not want a war. He wanted desecration. And for the first time in an age, Nurgle stood. His steps sank deep, and where he walked, the rot thickened. Trees rose higher, thicker, defiant. Spores rained in sheets, golden and endless. His laughter returned, not gentle but full, booming with the promise of resilience. He did not hate Khorne. He loved him as one loves the fire that burns away weakness, but he would not allow his children to be erased. The clash was not battle but collision. When Nurgle and Khorne met, the warp convulsed. Blight met blade, serenity met slaughter. The garden turned battlefield, its hymns drowned in howls. Beasts of blood and bile tore at one another beneath skies that bled green and crimson. Khorne's axe split the air with perfect fury, carving down pox beasts by the dozens. Yet for each that fell, 3 more rose, stitched together from the corpses of joy. Nurgle moved slowly, deliberately, letting wounds bloom across his form, each one birthing more defiance. He bled rot that ate steel, wept tears that softened rage. He wrapped Khorne's champions in vines, not to kill them, but to hold them, whispering to their thrashing forms that they were still loved. This was not a war of dominance. It was a lesson. And slowly, the garden began to win, not by might, not by cunning, but by refusal. Refusal to end, refusal to yield. Khorne roared with all the fury of dying stars, but the garden did not flinch. It swallowed the fire, absorbed the rage, and transformed it into life. When at last he withdrew, it was not defeat, it was disgust. He would not feast where there was no hate. And Nurgle, watching him vanish beyond the mist, did not jeer. He only turned back to the wounded grove and knelt, cradling the broken trees in arms vast and warm. He hummed a lullaby as he worked, one sung in forgotten dialects, soft as soil. Around him the garden healed, not quickly, but surely, and when it bloomed again, it bloomed stronger, for it had known pain. In the warp, where all thoughts drift eventually, one truth was now certain. Nurgle could be wounded, his garden could be burned, but it would never, ever stop growing. In the shadow of 10,000 forgotten worlds, where silence drifted heavier than air, and the bones of cathedrals crumbled into soft mounds, a child lay dying. Her name would never be recorded, for the city around her had no name anymore, only dust. The plague had taken everything, her family, her neighbours, the laughter from the streets, even the light from the sun. She coughed beneath the bent arch of a ruined shrine, her body too small for the sickness that filled it. Her skin shimmered with fever sweat, her breath rattled like paper, but her eyes remained open, wide and calm. She had stopped crying days ago, not because the pain had lessened, but because it had become familiar, like a lullaby sung too many times to fear. Alone in a world of ruin, she whispered to no one, her voice thin and trembling, "I don't want to go yet." And someone, somewhere, heard her. The air shifted, not with cold, not with heat, but with something softer, like the moment between exhale and inhale. From the mist stepped a figure vast and strange, too large for the space it occupied, and yet impossibly gentle. His skin was a tapestry of decay, folds upon folds of flesh embroidered with vines, sores, and blooming fungi that pulsed with warm light. He carried no weapon, wore no crown, spoke no threat. He knelt beside the child, and the stone beneath him softened into moss. She looked up at him, unafraid, her eyes reflecting his endless smile. He reached into his robes and drew forth a flower unlike any other, a single petal made from bone, wrapped in glistening veins of green. He offered it to her, not as a cure, but as a choice. She took it with trembling fingers and pressed it to her chest. Her body convulsed once, twice, and then grew still, not dead, not alive, changed. From the cracks in the pavement, tendrils of moss bloomed outward. The walls wept sap that smelled of memory. The wind no longer stung. Where the child had lain, now stood a small tree, its bark warm, its leaves whispering forgotten songs. The flower pulsed at its core, beating like a heart. The god of decay stood in silence, watching. He did not speak. He did not need to. For in that moment a promise had been made, not to dominate, not to destroy, but to wait, to linger at the edge of sorrow and offer something stranger than salvation, mercy. And so it began, across the Imperium, where hope had collapsed and the Emperor's light flickered low. Dreams changed. Men and women, rotting in their final hours, began to see gardens in their sleep. They spoke of a great tree with lungs, of laughter that soothed rather than mocked, of a father who arrived too late for pain but always in time for peace. The ecclesiarchy burned the dreamers, named them heretics, but the spores had already spread. On one hive world, the dead began to sing. On another, infants were born smiling with mossy eyes, and always, at the heart of each miracle, lay a single flower of bone and light, blooming where no life should have taken root. Nurgle did not rejoice. He did not gloat. He simply returned to his garden and knelt among his children, letting their songs wash over him. The gift had been given. The warp would carry it now, cradled in the coughs and prayers of mortals who had no more tears left to offer. And he, the patient one, would wait for the next soul to whisper that most human of words into the dark, please. The garden was quiet now, not silent, never silent, but quiet in the way a body rests after a long fever, still twitching with dreams beneath the skin. Nurgle sat, alone beneath a tree older than memory, its trunk gnarled with the names of those long forgotten, and its roots soaked in the sorrow of 1,000 galaxies. Around him, the air trembled with warmth and damp, thick with the perfume of rot and nectar. Flowers swayed without wind, exhaling spores that shimmered like starlight. His demons slumbered deep in the undergrowth, curled into nests made of bones and vines, their laughter dim to murmurs. Even the flies buzzed more slowly now, as if time itself had softened at the edges. He did not move, not out of weakness, but out of reverence. Something was ending, and he knew better than any god not to interrupt the final breath of a cycle. He remembered the first breath, the trembling gasp of a mortal man terrified of death. He had cradled that fear, fed it slowly, warmed it into understanding. It had taken ages. It had taken pain, but it had bloomed. Now, across the stars, his gifts were everywhere. In the cracks of grand cathedrals where moss crept unchecked, in the lungs of broken warriors who no longer feared the dark, in the soft eyes of children who smiled through fever. He had become more than pestilence. He was the memory of everything that had been left behind. He was every goodbye never spoken, every decay made sacred, every body returned to the soil. And in all of it, he had laughed, not to mock, but to remind the universe that even endings could be held with joy. But there was weight in eternity. Love too long carried becomes sorrow. Nurgle felt it settle now beneath his vast skin, not as regret, but as ache. He had held the broken for so long that he had forgotten how to let go. And yet, the galaxy kept moving, bleeding forward into newer agonies. The other gods danced in chaos and rage, pulling mortals into endless spirals, but he sat still, holding each life that had ever whispered his name. His garden, once riotous with colour and chorus, now breathed slowly, as if waiting for something more than rebirth. Perhaps it was time to sleep. Not end. Gods do not end, but sleep, deep and dreaming, cradled in his own roots. He reached down and placed his hand upon the soil. It pulsed once, then settled. The vines curled inward like closing eyes. The flowers stopped swaying. The air grew still. He closed his eyes and listened to the heartbeat of his garden one last time. It was slow, full, content. He whispered a name only he remembered, his own, from before the garden, before the godhood, before the rot. It left his lips like vapour and was swallowed by the soil, taken into the cycle where all names go. He smiled. He did not need to be remembered. His work was never about worship. It had always been about holding what no one else would. Above him, the sky dimmed to a gentle twilight, and the spores glittered like dying stars. The garden did not weep. It waited, because even gods must rest, and even decay must pause between pulses. And in the stillness that followed, where no laughter echoed, and no fly stirred, the universe sighed through the leaves. Somewhere far beyond the warp, a child would cough her first breath. Somewhere else, a soldier would close his eyes without fear. And in those quiet places, the garden would begin again. The end.